Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
I'm Dion Mitchell here with my Crime Redefined co-host, Mehul Anjaria. Today we have the honor of speaking with the spouse of a victim of an incredibly violent crime. Don Johnson recently released his book, Who's Watching You?, which details his wife Ellen's 2001 ordeal and serves as a warning to all of us to be more vigilant.
Sadly, Don lost his wife Ellen to cancer in 2018. Not only is Don's book a warning to other potential victims, but it chronicles the important role that Ellen had in expanding the DNA database in Louisiana so that it would include samples from more individuals who were arrested for certain crimes.
On March 11th, 2001, the lives of Ellen and Don were changed forever. Ellen was 52 at the time and by all accounts had a great life. She went to a Walmart early that Sunday morning feeling completely safe and particularly knowing that there was security cameras everywhere. Then the unthinkable happened.
As Ellen began to enter her truck to drive away, she was suddenly stabbed multiple times from behind. And after a 1-minute struggle, the assailant threw her into the truck, removed her wedding ring, and took her truck keys. She bravely fought back, hitting him in the head with a canned good. But this monster continued to hit her and stab her and drove off with her in the truck and brazenly waved to the surveillance cameras as he sped off.
As the truck drove off, Ellen was bleeding and in shock. The assailant pulled the truck over and sexually assaulted her. He said that he was going to take her somewhere to wash the DNA away and claimed he knew a perfect spot where nobody would find her.
Ellen knew she had to act to save her life at that point, and she called upon her faith. She saw two men at the side of the road in a pasture and decided to go for it, meaning jump out of a truck that was moving at more than 50 miles an hour in order to save her life. She heard God's voice telling her that it would be okay. And witnesses who saw this described it looking like a mannequin was rolling around on the ground. And if that wasn't bad enough, the crazed assailant circled back with the truck, trying to run Ellen over.
Wow. All told, her physical injuries were as follows: broken arm in 2 places, shattered left ankle, broken right toe, left shoulder and hip dislocated, bedridden for 77 days, in a wheelchair for 3 months, and on a single crutch for 90 days.
Wow, that's horrible. And, that doesn't even count the emotional scars as well. So with that, let's get ready for a very intense interview with Don.
Absolutely. Hello, Don. Thanks so much for joining us on Crime Redefined to discuss your very moving new book.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's get into this. We're really excited to talk with you. So we'll jump in. I'm curious to know how difficult it was to write this book, both emotionally and physically, and the writing process itself.
Well, it was very emotional. Every day I had to live it. It took me right at a year, believe it or not. Mostly because I was coming out of the first year of losing my wife, Ellen. And that was the hardest time. And then trying to put it back into words, what happened to us, reliving the incident every day.
Were you able to sit down and there were like times where you had to take a week off or a day off or something to gather yourself?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Many times I just couldn't keep going into it because I kept on remembering. And, when you're trying to heal, it's a little tough trying to remember such a horrendous incident in a life. Well, the one inspiration I did, I actually took a vacation during all this and, actually sitting on the beach, it came to mind, this is the time for me to put into words before my day is done here on earth, try and help other people out there, and mostly women. That's what Ellen and I had talked about, was trying to help women prevent these things from occurring to them. She never wanted this to ever happen to any of them.
It's really noble.
Yeah, she was a great woman, really, to me. I mean, the love of my life.
Well, tell us more about that, Don. What was your wife like, and what was life with her like, before that terrible day?
Well, when Ellen and I met, we actually met over a phone call. And we liked each other's tone of voice and mannerism, and we decided to have coffee. And we did, and that was it. We decided from that point we'd get together, and we worked both together in Nashville at the time. And then my company closed, and I had an opportunity to move back to my home state, Louisiana. And she decided to come, and we got married. And it was great. I mean, it was one of those great lives that you go through.
So everything was good and until this incident happened. And I'm wondering, have you or your wife ever been victims of a crime like this before, or known anybody that was suffered a violent crime?
Oh, I have. Myself. I was in Washington, D.C. I was working there. I was there for a year and actually came back to Louisiana for Thanksgiving. And when I went back, found that I had a tennis shoe and a dress shoe left. They cleaned me out, and 2 weeks later, I was held up at gunpoint.
So you were robbed, and then actually, in a separate incident, someone pulled a gun on you.
In two separate incidents. So after that point, I decided to leave Washington, D.C. and came back to Louisiana. Then I went to Nashville after that point. And that's how I met Ellen.
And Don, during the course of the investigation of your wife's case and ultimately the trial, give us your impressions of the criminal justice system and how it worked or how it didn't work.
Well, I thought it worked very well. He was captured within 3 days. He was still in the vehicle, and deputy saw him and turned around. By the time she turned around to get on him, he had already abandoned the vehicle, and he was in his home neighborhood and ran to his mother's house. They captured him soon after, and along with all the forensics that they had available, plus Ellen's identification of him, it was a prosecutable situation at that point.
How long after the incident, Don, was it until the trial actually started?
1 year. They thought it was very fast because situation, and but the evidence was overwhelming, and they wanted to get it behind them.
Definitely, Don. And to that point, during the trial, when the DNA evidence was presented by the law enforcement expert, what was that like for you? What were you thinking? And also, could you tell what the jurors' reaction was to this scientific evidence?
Well, DNA 20 years ago was really something in the sidelines. People knew of it, but they really didn't rely on it as anything that could really change laws or criminals' activity. Ray Wickenhauser, who's the one who was in charge of the crime lab in New Iberia Parish, was a Canadian with great degrees and came down and worked in the lab and had been there and running the lab for quite a long time. And his lab employees are the ones who captured a serial killer by using the DNA process behind what we did for him. The DNA factor, I think, was quite useful and substantiated all the other evidence. They had fingerprints, they had semen, they had clothing. So they had what they wanted, plus him being seen in the vehicle.
And in the courtroom itself, when this evidence was being laid out, particularly the scientific part, could you get a read on how it was clicking with the jurors, at the time in the courtroom?
Well, they were all quite attentive. They were all listening in detail because he was going through all the DNA factors, how they come about factoring who has what and everything else. And then it came up to a point that he showed that it was impossible for anybody else other than the odds of 1 out of 12 million being anyone else.
So they were really locked in on that.
Yes, they were.
Besides the obvious physical scars from the incident, what were some of the emotional scars that both you and your wife were burdened with after the crime?
Well, the hardest thing I think a man has to realize is that during a rape and an attack such as this, their wife is never at fault. And they have to move beyond the point of them being raped. Our recovery was actually mutual. We talked to each other all the time. We gave each other security, always knowing that I was behind her and she was behind me. No matter what happens, if we were there to the end. And we were.
It sounds like the communication was key to making that happen.
It is, because it takes a heart to open up to a person who's hurt, to feel their pain, to know what it would be like. The thing that happened to Ellen was horrible. I mean, to be attacked in a parking lot, which everyone thought would be a secure parking lot.
Right.
And fight with them for over a minute and be stabbed 7 times in the incident and be thrown into a vehicle and beaten. That was horrible enough. He could have left her there. No, he wanted to take her with him. And in doing so, the cameras, they recorded everything. But no one watched. No one came. No one. He even waved to him as he went out.
Man, it takes some real guts on his part. He must have felt really confident about what he was doing.
Well, he had been out of prison 2 weeks under a good time law back then. And you see that coming up across the country right now, wanting to let prisoners out of prison. The problem was he was a model prisoner, right? But he had been in there for the same incident where he had an attack on another woman. He had a term, but they let him out because he was a cook in the kitchen. They thought he was a good participant for the program, and it helped them with their budgetary problems. Well, unfortunately, they don't have the people outside to supervise them when they get there. That was our problem. He was out over 2 weeks and never seen his supervisor or parole officer. And no one even looked for him.
Don, what was the significance of the title, Who's Watching You?
I thought about it for a long time. There were several that came to mind, but this one, I put myself in her place. Someone was watching her. She didn't know it. And that's the point I want to make is that when you go out in public, people are watching you, but for what reason? You don't know. Just be cautious. Not to be inhuman, to be harsh toward anyone. Just be cautious. I always watch over behind my shoulder. I kind of keep a third eye. I'm used to it. But there are women out there that go out and just, like a daisy-glow, just running from mall to mall, not thinking about a thing. But they have to think they may not come home one day. I was fortunate. Ellen did jump and save her life, so at least I knew what happened.
Right.
He was going to throw her body into the Chapelaya Basin. We'd have never known what happened to her. And I would have to suffer 20 years of not knowing. And I think that's the harshest part.
What type of advice, what would be the one piece of advice or support would you offer victims of such terrible crimes, if you could give one piece to somebody?
Well, you have to go inside first, because you have to realize who you are. Ellen's strength was in her religion, and his too. Without God in my life, I don't think I'd get up in the morning. She relied on him for salvation. And I'll tell you this, and I'll tell you public, and they may think I'm crazy. But at the end, her last day, The family was gathered around her in the hospital, and so was I. I stayed with her every night, and I held her hand while she slept. When she woke for the last time, she told us, while I was holding her hand, she told me she could see Jesus and he was coming for her. And she could see his kingdom. Behind the family on the wall, I could see him. I could see his kingdom. So I'm not worried about where I'm going. I don't worry about where she is. And that's her greatest strength. That's how she got along with everything. That's how she survived all those years. She called upon him, and every day was a new day to her. And that was our strength.
Don, tell us about your wife's role in broadening the use of DNA testing in criminal investigations in Louisiana.
At the time, the Anjaria sheriff was interested in introducing swabbing in a new form that he had heard about, which was not instituted into Louisiana yet. At that time, you could only have a person's DNA taken from them as if they were incarcerated. They needed someone to help along with pushing this law. Ellen, unfortunately, became what I consider their poster child. They came to us and asked we would go and talk to the legislation and our police force to see if they could get this law instituted, that once you were suspect of a crime, you could have your DNA put into a file. And from there on, you'd have to worry about what crime you might commit, which was a good deterrent for law-breaking people. And she went before them in Baton Rouge, and there were over 300 state troopers plus legislation. And as I was talking to Ray this morning, he was there, and I didn't remember, but how silent it had gotten when she spoke. And she spoke for 5 minutes. He said you could hear a pin drop. They were all listening to her story and her conviction on it. In the book, I wish I could have put photographs that were taken by the newspaper, because they captioned her intensity that she was showing to them. Why she was so adamant about getting this introduced so it would never have this happen to another woman without some type of help.
Well, that showed a lot of bravery, and it sounded like she was really critical in getting DNA used to help solve more of these cases.
I believe so, and she was never thanked for it, other than by a few people.
Really,
the state I always thought older, an apology for what happened to her, because I kind of held them a little bit at fault for not having somebody to do to check in with the prisoner when he got out of jail.
Right.
So I kind of, I let that go, but I can't hold things against people as I go through my life.
Another gap you pointed out, Don, was this business about surveillance cameras that, they're all over there and they're on, but nobody's watching the actual cameras. And, if something's going live, it can't be prevented. But I was just curious, in your wife's case, the footage that they got from those cameras, was it clear enough to actually identify the perpetrator?
No. Only the situation. As always, they always get the cheapest equipment they can.
True.
But they should have, I thought, at most stores, some type of security outside because of these situations that occur. For a long time, these big retailers were having instances almost every other week where someone was being kidnapped. But, without anyone to call a police force quickly or to have their own force in place, you can't deter them. They'll do what they want when they get out.
Yeah, you're right, Don. And I have to tell you, in my experience reviewing cases, I can't believe how many times the cops go around and talk to neighboring businesses or residents about their surveillance camera. And it's always, oh, we didn't have it turned on, or it wasn't working, or we weren't taping, or something like that. So, I mean, in that scenario, they're barely of any use.
Correct. In fact, that was one of the things that we went after when we did go after the retailer. We went after his cameras. And the eventual settlement on all that was that it was left up to the merchant themselves.
Wow. So they're not in any way compelled to have operating surveillance cameras?
No.
Wow.
Which is, I think, a big injustice to the public, because it gives you a false sense of security when you
That's
do
right.
it.
Yeah, that's right. You think that you're going on there and people are actually paying attention, or even the cameras are being manned at the time, and they're not. They're just kind of running, just so it's almost like the cameras that are in the store on the outside are just there for show.
Correct. You know, it would have changed the situation for Ellen if someone would have been watching.
You know, Don, before your wife's ordeal, what did you know about the use of DNA in a criminal matters? Because we got to remember, this is 20 years ago, right?
Yes, it was.
So
I didn't know much about court DNA matters, other than at the time, I think they were trying to get some prisoners out of prison. That was about the only thing they were trying to do. And that was the only incidences that I remember it being used.
Don, did your wife or anyone else encourage you to write this book, or was this something that just you came up with on your own?
I wrote it myself. Like I said, I wish I would have been allowed to keep a lot more material there. But again, when you're writing a book, you learn where your rights stand and what you can and can't put into it. I wasn't going to be held blackmail for certain photographs that I thought should have been released to me for free. Well, you learn about a book, you know. The publisher I went with really helped me out quite a bit, but the story was mine.
Other than the publisher, while you were writing this, did you have anyone else you could reach out to for input or support?
I had a friend who kind of supported me and in a way of telling me to continue to tell the story. But as outside of facts and everything else.
So you're kind of just a one man show at during the process.
Yeah, I just felt like I had to tell it, I guess, my way, as best as I could.
You know, what are you looking to accomplish with the book? And if you could pick a particular demographics, who should read this and why?
Well, actually, I believe every girl who's 8 years old on up should read the story. And I think a lot of things would change in their attitude about how they go about their daily lives. My main goal for writing this was, one, to tell the world what Ellen did, how strong, and give women encouragement. I know there are a lot of crimes that women are suffering through. Domestic violence, violence upon them in the streets, all situations out there. And I thought maybe this, seeing how Ellen healed, they could heal, give them comfort in it. And, to realize this is not the end of my life.
Right.
I'm not going to let somebody else control it.
Well, Don, you are a very brave and inspiring man, and we really appreciate your time today. It was great speaking with you.
Oh, it was great talking to you guys. And I appreciate what you're doing out there, because I know you're doing a good job by getting out the word to the public about crime situations.
Absolutely.
And why DNA is such a big factor in it.
Yeah, it's the way that we can do that is people like yourself coming forward and sharing their stories, and we understand it's really hard to do and to talk about this and relive it over and over again. So we really appreciate your time and sharing with us, and for joining us on Crime Redefined today.
Well, it was a pleasure talking with both of you. And I hope in the future we can do something else.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely, Don. We wish you much success with the book and all of your endeavors. And, we'll stay in touch.
Mehul, that was really powerful stuff.
Oh, man. Was it ever?
I was definitely hanging on Don's every word. I mean, he's really a brave soul to discuss his wife's ordeal to hopefully save others.
Yeah, me too. This was definitely one of those where I would almost forget to ask him another question because I was just so riveted by his story and really the emotion that came through in his voice.
I agree.
And, this whole episode made me think of something. I've said, I think on this podcast, but, that if you're a brand new criminalist and you're working in a law enforcement crime laboratory, for balance, I think it's very important that you actually go to a jail and see how your work can affect somebody. The fact that your work could put somebody in jail and, see what that really looks like in real life. But, the same goes. Yeah. I mean, the same goes for the other side though. Right. So if you're doing defense work, it's just not all on paper, man. Again, these are real people, real victims. And I think that you absolutely need to be exposed to victim stories and how crime affects not just the victim, of course, but their whole family. And I think this is particularly true if a defense forensics expert has never worked in law enforcement previously. And Dion, I was at a conference a year or two ago, and there was a speaker. A woman went up there and she started telling this story that really ended up it was the story of her being raped. And we knew that she was a prosecutor, but it turns out that she was the one who had been raped. And man, it was just a really moving moment. It just makes you think about the importance and the gravity of what you do when you work in this kind of field.
Absolutely. And then now you have the trend towards criminal justice reform, and it's increasing daily. We have to look at the possible negative effects.
Yep.
The perpetrator here was let out early on good behavior as a model prisoner. He didn't report to his parole officer. And from what Don said, it sounded like there wasn't adequate funding to keep tabs on the guy.
Yeah, that's a real shame. It's like there wasn't that safety net here in the system that, and we don't know the details, but if he didn't show up to report to his parole officer, it sounds like maybe there wasn't someone to just go snag him up right away, which is kind of the point of the whole system.
I mean, the framework was there, but in life, it's always about the execution.
Yeah,
right? That's here it was there. It was a parole officer. He got out. Everything worked except the execution.
Yeah, and let's face it, there could be people who are model prisoners who behave in prison, but once they get out, they do exactly what they were doing. So this is a complicated issue, but for sure. If any good came out of Ellen's story, I hesitate to say that, but by her testimony and her advocacy, that expanded the use of DNA testing in Louisiana. So in the early days of the CODIS database, the way people got in there is if they were convicted of very serious crimes, rape, murder, kidnapping, something like that. But over the years, things have evolved to where if you're even arrested for certain crimes or maybe even a felony, that they're going to take a DNA sample from you. And that's how these databases have gotten so big. So it sounds like really Ellen advocating for that in Louisiana really expanded the database. And just as a parallel, here in California where we're at, in 2004, we had Prop 69. And the idea there was to expand how many samples are put into this CODIS database. So
hey, before you go on there, just give our listeners a quick debrief on the CODIS database again.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let me back up a little bit. So the FBI maintains this CODIS DNA database. It's the Combined DNA Index System. And it's a repository of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, people who've been arrested for qualifying crimes, missing persons, and also just DNA profiles from other crime scenes. So the idea is that if you are working a DNA case and you get a profile of a assailant, but you don't have someone to directly compare it to, you can then search it in this database. So obviously now as the number of profiles in the database has expanded, there's a higher probability of getting a hit and resolving the case. So just going back to the evolution in California, in 2004, we were only putting people in the database who were convicted of certain crimes, not necessarily every felony. So Prop 69 said, listen, we need to, if you're convicted of any felony, basically, your DNA sample needs to get in there. And then the next step was, within 5 years of the act, meaning 2009, that anybody who was arrested for a felony, they had to put a sample, they had to give a sample of DNA to put in the database. So you can see how in California over those 5 years, the number of samples just rose really, really quickly.
Absolutely, Mehul. There's often criticism of so-called true crime in the media in that it may sometimes glorify perpetrators and exploit victims or perhaps re-traumatize survivors or victims.
Yeah, right.
We hope that having a guest like Dawn puts the focus back on the human impact of these terrible crimes.
Well, this episode was something a little bit different for us, but I think very important. And I suppose Crime Redefined would be called a true crime podcast, just if you were to classify it. But that's not really exactly what we do, in that we're not looking at a one case or different cases every episode and dissecting them. And you and I kind of coined this new term, not true crime, but true justice. So I think that's how we would explain Crime Redefined. But, it is fascinating how when you're looking at the criminal justice system, things can get very procedural and legal and technical. And when that happens, there's a tendency to ignore or not realize the pain that families of victims and victims themselves, as well as offenders and their family, whether they're wrongfully convicted or rightfully convicted. You may not feel bad for the offender, of course, but they have families as well. So
that's right.
Yeah, this is really a human endeavor. So having a guest on like Dawn to really hear all sides of it, I think, is really instructive.
Well, that's a big part of why you and I we started this. We wanted to show every angle. It's not black and white. There's a lot of gray area, and we want to expose and highlight and shine daylight on this is from all sides. We hope that listening to Crime Redefined has made these tough times a little better for all of our fans. Thanks again for all of your support, and please feel free to interact with us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, or wherever you may find us. And if you've got a great idea for a guest or a topic, let us know.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.